Our story begins with a man named Abram. He lived in Ur, a bustling city in Mesopotamia. Life was comfortable, familiar, but then God spoke to Abram. He told him to leave his homeland. He was to journey to a new land, a land God would show him. This land was Canaan. Abram listened. He trusted God's promise. He packed his belongings, gathered his family, and began the long journey to Canaan. He was 75 years old. Abram's faith in God was absolute. He believed in the divine promise. A great nation would descend from him. This nation would inherit the land of Canaan. God made a covenant with Abram. A covenant is a sacred agreement. The Hebrew word for covenant is, meaning to cut. It signifies a binding agreement sealed with a sacrifice. God promised to bless Abram and his descendants. He changed Abram's name to Abraham, meaning father of many. Abraham's journey was a leap of faith. He left behind everything he knew. He traveled to a new land, trusting in God's promise. This act of faith marked the beginning of the Israelite people. It was the foundation upon which their entire history would be built. Abraham had a son, Isaac. Isaac continued the lineage of the covenant. He too fathered a son, Jacob. Jacob, later renamed Israel, had 12 sons. These sons became the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Hebrew word for Israel is often interpreted as he who wrestles with God. This name reflected Jacob's own struggle with faith and his eventual triumph. The lives of these patriarchs were filled with trials and triumphs. They faced famine, rivalry, and internal conflict. Yet, through it all, God's promise remained. Their families grew, their flocks multiplied, they spread throughout the land of Canaan. Each generation faced its own challenges, but through each challenge, the covenant endured. The promise of descendants, of a nation, of a land, was passed down from father to son. The stories of the patriarchs are central to Israelite identity. They highlight the importance of family, faith, and the enduring power of God's covenant. They lay the groundwork for the dramatic events that would unfold in Egypt. Jacob's favorite son was Joseph. His brothers, jealous of his favored status, sold him into slavery. Joseph ended up in Egypt. Despite this hardship, Joseph prospered. He rose through the ranks of Egyptian society, eventually becoming a powerful advisor to the pharaoh. A severe famine struck Canaan. Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to seek food. They encountered Joseph, who through a series of events revealed his true identity. He forgave his brothers and invited his entire family to settle in Egypt. The pharaoh welcomed them, granting them land in the fertile Nile Delta region. The Israelites thrived in Egypt. Their numbers grew exponentially. They lived in peace and prosperity for generations. What began as a small family had blossomed into a large and vibrant community. However, the passage of time brought about a change in leadership. A new pharaoh who knew nothing of Joseph or his service to Egypt rose to power. This pharaoh saw the Israelites as a threat. The new pharaoh enslaved the Israelites. They were forced into hard labor, building cities and working in the fields. Their lives became ones of hardship and oppression. Their cries for deliverance reached God. God chose Moses to be their deliverer. Moses was an Israelite, raised in the pharaoh's palace. He had fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite. Now God called him back to confront the pharaoh and demand the release of his people. Moses returned to Egypt. He stood before Pharaoh, proclaiming God's command, "Let my people go." Pharaoh refused. God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt. Each plague demonstrated God's power over the Egyptian gods. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs swarmed the land. Locusts devoured their crops. Finally, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, broke Pharaoh's resolve. Pharaoh relented and allowed the Israelites to leave Egypt. This event, known as the Exodus, marked a turning point in Israelite history. The Hebrew term for Exodus is literally meaning going out from Egypt. It signifies both a physical journey and a spiritual liberation. As the Israelites fled, Pharaoh changed his mind and pursued them with his army. The Israelites found themselves trapped between the pursuing Egyptians and the Red Sea. It seemed like all hope was lost. But then, God intervened. Moses stretched out his hand. The waters of the Red Sea parted. The Israelites walked across on dry ground. When the Egyptians followed, the waters rushed back, drowning the entire army. The Israelites were free.